Let me start from where I'll end, so you'll know where I'm going. Nature, from the Latin natus, to be born, implies natality, the birth of new beings into a world. Culture, also from the Latin collere, to cultivate, implies nurture, the care of these new beings so that they can grow and flourish. It is the task of every generation to bring new beings into the world and look after them in order that life itself will continue for generations to come. And this looking after is a process of education. Thus, we depend on both nature and culture, both birth and nurturance, for life to carry on. But this means reversing the posture of modernity, which, in laying claim to the present, has led us both to turn our backs on nature and to convert culture into heritage. In this posture, education is committed not to nurturance, but to progress, in which each generation is destined to replace its predecessor. My question is, what would it take to reverse it, to recover a sense of education as introducing new people into old ways? Because I think the sustainability of life to come depends on it. Now, of course, both words, nature and culture, have had long and complicated histories. They can mean all kinds of things depending on one's theoretical approach, and there is no point in trying to legislate on what their official meanings are. In my own discipline of anthropology, however, they have become closely linked to a certain discourse on universals and particulars. And this discourse holds that this discourse holds that there is such a thing as an essential human nature, often equated with the faculties of reason, language, and symbolic thought. What is both universal to humanity and puts humanity on a pedestal over and above beings of all other kinds. But these universal capacities admit to a diversity of content. All humans can reason, but rationality can work in many ways. All humans have a capacity for language, but they speak any number of different languages. All humans are capable of symbolic thought, and yet they have constructed symbolic systems of many different kinds. So in classical anthropology, culture signifies the diversity of rational, linguistic, and symbolic content downloaded into the universal capacities bequeathed by human nature. Now, my own strategy in introducing anthropology to students new to the subject has rather been to turn the concepts of nature and culture around, converting what might look like answers into questions. Rather than saying that nature is what all humans have in common and culture makes them different, I suggest to students that nature is a word for a question. The question is, what makes humans all the same? And culture is a word for another question. What makes humans different from one another? Now, to answer with the same words, to say, oh, we are all the same due to our shared human nature, or we are all different because of culture, is simply circular. It gets us nowhere. Treating questions as their own answers is a substitute for thought, a sort of short circuit. And more often than not, when we hear these words being used, that is exactly what happens. Everybody knows what makes humans the same, we say. It's human nature. And everyone knows why this group of people is different from that. It's because of their culture. But to the students, I say that nature and culture are not answers to their own questions. Rather, they challenge us to understand or even explain why humans might have things in common, or why they differ as they do. And in this challenge, I say, lies the whole scope of the subject of anthropology. However, while this might work as a point of departure, as we proceed in our anthropological investigations, we find the whole logic of universals and particulars increasingly questionable. Take language as an example. What we could call the standard view, which is still mainstream in psychology, if not in anthropology, has it that there is such a thing as a universal capacity for language, common to all humans, but that depending on the community in which you were born and brought up, this capacity will be filled with a grammar and a lexicon specific to the particular language of your community. The capacity for language, it is said, is innate, something we are all born with, part of a species-specific cognitive architecture, but the particular language is acquired by some process of cultural learning. But if we follow the process by which a human infant actually learns to speak, we find that there is absolutely no way to distinguish capacity from content. Learning to speak is learning to speak in the way of your community. So different ways of speaking are not added on to universals that are already in place. Rather, they emerge in the course of the early life of a new human being in an environment surrounded by others who are already speaking. To refer to universals as if they were already there, concretely wired into human brains even before the learning process begins, is an example of what the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. For in truth, what we call universals are no more than abstractions of our own, the results of our analytic attempts to filter out the general from the cornucopia of difference that lies before us. Now, it is not unreasonable to filter phenomena in this way, and indeed it would be almost impossible to do any scientific work if we did not. What is unreasonable is to impute to the resulting abstractions a real, concrete presence in the world. So the lesson from this language learning example is that differences are ever emergent within the unfolding of a field of relationships, such as between the young child and her caregivers, in which all are enmeshed ab initio from the start. So what we have in common from the start, what is universal, though in a different sense, is our enmeshment within this universe of relations. And each of us differs from each and every other because in our lives we trace a different path through this universe. That's why, following another philosopher, a contemporary of Whitehead, William James, we might better call this universe a pluriverse, a unified field of nevertheless infinite difference. And let me stress that this is a question of difference and not of diversity. The conceptual distinction between difference and diversity is critical. The idea of diversity belongs to the language of universals and particulars. It divides populations into classes and subclasses, just as in the biological taxonomy of genera, species, and subspecies. And it does so on the basis of received content. So we might say that here are all humans, and they all have something in common. But then there's this group of so they're all X. They all have X. But then this lot have A, and these ones have B, and these ones have C. So we say there's universal humanity, they all have X, but this lot is culture A, this lot is culture B, this lot is culture C. So it's a result of a process of classification, of sifting out what is particular, A, B, and C, from what is universal, X. So there are people like us, A's, defined in opposition to other people who are different, B's and C's. So we define us in opposition to them. We who share the same content as against them who don't. So all difference is shifted onto this boundary between us and them. The difference is all there. And this is the kind of logic that leads us to see a world divided into cultures and subcultures. But difference, as distinct from diversity, difference is really about differentiation. It is a becoming different within the very process of going along together. And the best analogy to help us think about this is a conversation. In a conversation, people bring into it their different voices and carry it along together. And as they do, each voice, while it responds to all the others, develops along its own path. And I call this correspondence, by which I mean a process in which several participants go along together, responding to one another as they go. In a conversation, or like in a piece of music, where each instrument plays a particular melody, is carrying along, but always responding to the other. And social life, I believe, is lived in correspondence. Now, this is the point at which we can return to the theme of education. Because I want to argue that education, too, can be understood as a process of correspondence. But this is not how it is understood in what we could call the mainstream. Because in mainstream discourse, education is held firmly between the universals of reason and the particularities of culture. Where reason points the way forward, culture points to the heritage we leave behind. So the mainstream model looks, the mainstream model looks something like this. That reason is going up here, and then backwards is bits of cultural heritage that have been left behind. So there you are, advancing through reason, holding onto your cultural heritage that you've left behind. That's the mainstream model. And the source of this discourse lies in the postural reversal that in many ways, I think, marks the birth of the modern era. To explain this, let me introduce another analogy. I want you to imagine a line of people standing in an orderly queue. Okay, this is in the UK, not in the continent. They stand in an orderly queue, one after the other. Up ahead are the people who arrived before you, and behind are the people who arrived later. And gradually everyone is shuffling forward. I mean, suppose you're queuing for the ice cream, and there's the ice cream van is up there, and you're here, people who before, they got you, and there are people behind. And gradually everybody moves forward so that you will eventually be where those who are ahead of you are now, and the people behind you will eventually be where you are now, and so on. Now, imagine that this queue is actually of human generations, one generation after the next. The people ahead of you are your ancestors. The people behind you are your descendants. You are, as we say, following in your ancestors' footsteps, while at the same time you are renewing a trail they have already made with your own life story. And a major part of this story, of course, is bringing descendants into the world who will eventually do the same. So you're carrying on like this. As you're carrying on in this way, you're also begetting another generation who will beget another one like that. And so it goes on. So you're moving in this way in the direction of, so suppose you are this generation. Well, this is your ancestor, this is your child, this is your grandchild, and the whole thing is gradually moving forward as you are begetting people backwards. Okay, so, and this moving forward is a process of aging, and this moving backwards is a process of begetting. So as we age, we beget life. We're moving forward in the direction of our ancestors. And even though your ancestors may no longer be alive and present in the world, they still exert a kind of hold over you. Well, that is to say, you are beholden to them. And in just the same way, descendants who have yet to be born will be beholden to you. And this is what it means, literally, to follow a tradition. Following a tradition doesn't mean being stuck in the past. It means finding a way into the future under the guidance of those who have gone before. And as you do so, you undergo this process of aging, and aging, as I show there, is the reverse of begetting. But now, suppose that some commander, some Enlightenment philosopher maybe, tells you, you must stop doing this. Turn round by 180 degrees. What happens then? So you've been carrying along in this queue. I shall just draw it again so it's simpler. So in the queue, right, here are you. That's your nose. You're going in that direction. And here's your ancestor, and here's your descendant. And you're all carrying along in this direction. So this is the future, and this is the past. And here are you. Now suppose you are told, turn around. Then you find that your ancestors They're going off into the past, whilst your descendants are coming straight at you. They're the future. So in turning around, you've turned your back on the past, and you face a future that is coming right at you. Okay? So that's a sort of confrontation here. And in doing so, you have staked a claim for the present. There's no present here. What we would call the present is just the future's past. But here you say, right. It's like, imagine you're standing in this queue, right? There's the ice cream van. You're standing in this way. There are the people in front of you. There are the people behind. And you turn around, and you face all the people are coming at you, and you say, stop, this is a hold-up. You're saying, you can't move, not until I let you pass. And because I am in control and in command of the present, and I am going to project onto you a project of my own, and that will be the future. And the ancestors, well, they're forget about them. So that's what would happen if you were suddenly told to turn around on the present. The people who were once before you are now at your back, while you now find yourself face to face with those who were once following after. So the future, which had previously stretched into the distance along ancestral paths, now appears to be a future that is heading on a collision course straight towards you. The future is something that is coming at you. It's not something that is stretching out into the distance. Whilst your ancestors, on whom you've now turned your back, are receding ever further into the past. Their time is over. So this very act of turning, or conversion, if you like, stakes a claim for the present. And this present is a hold-up, an attempt to arrest the passage of time, to bring it to a standstill. But of course, no generation can hold its ground indefinitely. Eventually, the pressure becomes too great, and it is either pushed aside or forced to move on, to make way for the next generation, which promptly does the same, turning its back on the one preceding only to face its successor. And the moment it turns, it takes the stand of a new present. So history reappears as a punctuated series of generational turning points. This is what the rhetoric calls a turning point. There was a real turning point in history. You turned around and it's like that. And then the next generation will turn around, and the next generation will turn around, and each claiming the present for itself. Of course, we do this in scholarship too. Have you all been trying to keep up with whatever is the latest turn in your discipline? It's the most scary thing, that people are always turning, and you have to try and catch up with them. Such, I believe, is the predicament of modernity. And one of its consequences is to convert the process of begetting, by which each generation nourishes the development of the next, into a thing of the past to be handed down as an inheritance or as heritage. Because to inherit something, it has to be broken off from the ebb and flow of life. It has to be packaged up and transmitted intact to the recipient. That's why children cannot inherit their parents. A child can inherit his or her parents' property or the house, but they can't inherit the parent. Nor can they inherit nurturance, the care of offspring by their parents, the affective milieu in which they are raised, because this carries on. This is a life process. You can't inherit something that is in fact an ongoing process of life. So you can inherit a property, you can inherit a heritage, a package of stuff, but you can't inherit the affective milieu in which you grew up, in which you were nourished and grown by your parents. Or rather, if it is to be inherited, then it's something you have to put behind you, rounded off and closed. You have to turn your back on it. And it is precisely that moment of turning your back on the past to claim the present. It's in that moment that begetting becomes heritage and nurture is turned into culture. The process of nurture that goes on becomes a package of culture which you inherit. It's a kind of objectification of the past. You say, the past is over, that's done, but I'll wrap it up and we can pass it on to the next generation. So turning to education, are we to see this as a process in which the teacher stands face to face with a future generation coming towards her, having turned her back on the past, or as a process in which the teacher continues along the ways of predecessors, beckoning her students to follow? Do the students appear in front of her or follow after? Now, I'll call the attitude of the teacher who stands to face her students the academic posture. So here we have, so we have the modern teacher who's turned to face her students. She's turned her back on the past, and she was going that way, but she's turned her back on the past. Here's the future. So this is the children's generation, this is the teacher's generation. They're standing with one another face to face. So I'll call that is the academic posture. Face to face. Teacher has the knowledge, the student is being told what they're supposed to know. I'll call that the academic posture. So it's premised on the teacher's social accreditation with both superior knowledge and the qualification to pass it on. And the aim is to raise students from a presumed baseline of ignorance through a series of stages to an adult level of understanding on which they can build when their time comes. But I'm going to contrast this academic posture with the posture of companionship. With companionship, teacher and students are facing in the same direction. So the teacher is still going this way, and the students are following after. So that's companionship. They're teacher, students, all going along together, like in the queue. So with companionship, teacher and students face in the same direction, but more than that, and I should do another diagram here, the one actually leans over the others. So I'm going to draw companionship like this. The teacher is moving forward, and here's the student, but the teacher is, as we say, leaning over the student, right? So that it's not just completely following one behind the other, but a leaning over. So I call that leaning. On the other hand, they're also leading out, and I'll come to that. So the teacher is leading out on the way forward, but also leaning back over the next generation that's coming along in the same direction. And my contention is that this posture of leaning over, laden as it is with care and compassion, has the potential to transform the very meaning and purpose of education from the efficient transfer of knowledge from teachers of one generation to students of the next, to opening a path or showing the way, guiding attention towards aspects of the world that might deserve further scrutiny. Literally, after all, at least according to one etymology, to educate means to lead out. It comes from ex, meaning out, and docere, meaning to lead. So to educate is to lead people, lead students out into the world. And taken in this original sense, so education leads us out into the world so that we can both attend and respond to it. And in leading out, it persistently pulls us away from established standpoints, from any claims we might make for the present. So an education that leads out in front, as I've shown there, also leans over behind. So even as the educator proceeds along the ways of predecessors, she also bends over backwards, as we say, to look after her student followers. I don't know if you have this phrase in French, but we say, you bend over backwards to help somebody. It means you're really looking after them. So this bending over backwards is a perfect description of this gesture of companionship, of leaning over. So leading out is to leading over here, as aging is to begetting. So this is going forward, this is aging, this is begetting in that way. Or maybe I should, that's all right. Now for the philosopher of education, whose work you may know, Jan Maestlijn, based in Leuven, the practice of leading out and leaning over amounts to what he calls poor pedagogy. Poor pedagogy has no position to uphold, no body of knowledge to transmit, no great project to realize. It works rather through the displacement of its disciples, through moving them out of position, through what Maestlijn calls exposure. Exposure means expositio, moving out of position. Rather than saying, this is where I stand, this is me, and I'm firmly standing on this point, and I'm going to convince you of all this. Exposure does the opposite. It says, no, pull you out of that. And that makes you insecure, and because it makes you insecure, you actually start to think. So a poor pedagogy, according to Jan Maestlijn, invites us to exchange our comfort zone of safety and security for weakness and vulnerability. Far from arming us with knowledge or shoring up our defenses so we can better cope with adversity, the aim of poor pedagogy is to disarm, to expose, and by the same token, to sharpen our attention to the world around us so that we can respond with skill and sensitivity to what is going on there. So in poor pedagogy, teachers and students go along together in each other's company. Now, the journey can be difficult, risky, uncomfortable, with no guaranteed outcome. And the job of the teacher is certainly not to make things easy for students. But it is, however, to set an example, to serve as a generous guide, a constant companion, and a tireless critic. And students, following their teacher's example, should not be afraid to copy, just as the apprentice will copy in learning a craft. There's no expectation on students to innovate, as in the academic posture, which measures added value in educational progression by the novelty of outcomes and disqualifies copying as plagiarism. In the posture of companionship, copying is not plagiarism, it is practice. Just as an apprentice, the student practices under the eyes of the teacher, only eventually to become those eyes watching in turn over the next generation. And as the tradition carries on, founded on the assurance that students who cannot be compelled to learn are nevertheless eager to join in the endeavors of their teachers, and to relay the torch of learning for generations to come. Now, this kind of education, as ex ducere, calls for a readiness to go along with others and to answer to them as you go. Or in a word, it fosters responsibility. Right, that's a kind of key word. Responsibility. Now, this is not a new idea. So far as I know, it was first introduced by the composer John Cage in a lecture delivered in 1957. Only in the presence of things, Cage said, can we feel them, and only through feeling can we respond. Apparently unaware of this precedent, the cultural theorist Donna Haraway has recently reinvented the term in much the same sense. Responsibility, she says, is a praxis of care and response. And yet, Cage's was not the only precedent, because a decade before Haraway latched onto the term, it was also used by the educational theorist Gert Biester. For Biester, responsibility refers to a certain voice. It's a voice of one's own that nevertheless only comes forth in soliciting others to respond in theirs. So like a line in a conversation, every voice continually emerges in and through its joining with and differentiating from the voices of others. That's what I earlier called correspondance. So what would it mean, and this is Biester's question, what would it mean to prioritize the development of responsibility over the advance of reason in education? Now, for more than 3 centuries in the Western world, education has been regarded as the primary engine of social progress. It has been the means by which advances in human knowledge, forged by bringing powers of reason to bear on the material of empirical observation, have been added from one generation to the next, allowing each to stand on the shoulders of predecessors. However, the voice of reason belongs to no one. It transcends all variations of experience. And it's this voice, both instructive and impersonal, that academic education aims to inculcate in students, specifically by dissociating knowledge from personal experience and making it accessible to all. In the community of reason, as the philosopher Alfonso Lingis has put it, everyone is interchangeable. Problems have their right answers, which are the same, whoever happens to come up with them. But a pedagogy of responsibility, by contrast, would reverse the priorities of the academic posture, positioning attention to ever-emergent difference ahead of standardized measures of attainment. If in the community of reason it doesn't matter who you are, so long as it's new, in the community of responsibility it matters more than anything. Because it is precisely because every voice in the community is different that its people are bound together. It's a community, as Lingis says, of those who have nothing in common. And having nothing in common, each has something to give. And community comes from the word communus, which means giving together. There's a point in a book by Roberto Esposito has talked about this. Now, of course, every human being is born into the world. This is the elementary fact of natality, from which our word nature comes. It means that for those who have already been around for a while and are familiar with the ways of the world, their first task is to introduce these new beings into it. And that, for the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, is the task of education, introducing new people into a world with which we, more experienced, have lived a bit longer, are already familiar. It is a relation between adults and children, in which adults shoulder the responsibility for children's nurture or development. Now, throughout most of human history, as Arendt observes, this relation between grown-ups and children has arisen normally and naturally from the fact that people of all ages and of overlapping generations would spontaneously carry on their lives together in the world. And because of this intergenerational overlap, young people would have ample opportunities to hear the stories and practice the skills of their elders, and to relay them in the passage of their own lives, becoming exemplary storytellers and practitioners in their turn for generations to come. So it is by lovingly leaning over along their old ways as they head out into the future that elders create the conditions for the young to embark on a path of rejuvenation. And in this, as we've seen, in this lies the continuity of tradition. And yet, in the present day and age, this continuity has been ruptured. Generations have been so prized apart that they no longer overlap, but rather stack up. They're layered over so that they replace one another. The picture I have in my mind is of the difference between a rope and a stack. I mean, throughout history, generations have gone along like this. So here's one, there's another one, and there's another one, and there's another one. So they're aligned along their length, and that is a bit like each life is the strand of a rope, and you wind them all together, and the rope just carries on in this way. But in modernity, we begin to see generations like this. So this is a generation, the next generation layered on top of it, the next one layered on top of it, and so on. So each generation replaces the one before. So if this is my generation, then this is my parents' generation, this is my children's generation. And one of the effects of that, of course, is to split these generations apart so that grandparents and grandchildren are separated by the generation in between. So one of the conditions of modern society is precisely that the young and the elderly are not naturally and spontaneously living their lives in parallel, but are actually belonging to different layers, split apart by the generation that has staked a claim to the present by turning around on it. And with the consequent breakdown of everyday intergenerational relations, elders are prevented from introducing young people into traditional lifeways as they used to do. Rather, the responsibility for their education has been transferred in large part to the state. And for Arendt, who was writing in 1954 in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was the failure of the state to discharge the responsibility vested in it by way of this transfer that underlay what she saw as her day's crisis in education. So instead of introducing young people into an old world, the state sets out to prepare these young people for a new world. And such preparation, Arendt thinks, offers but a pretense of education, the real purpose of which is not to introduce the young, but to indoctrinate them. And the coercive effect of this indoctrination is to deny them any chance of making a future they can call their own. Now, we can plainly recognize in the attitude of a generation that has staked a claim on the present by turning around to face its successors coming towards it, while turning its back on predecessors, the attitude I already introduced earlier. This is a generation, I call it Generation Now, that for this generation, for Generation Now, the future is cast as a project and the past as heritage. Its agents of education, seeing the next generation heading straight towards them and threatening eventually to take their place, demand that young people conform to the new order, the order of the project, while standing as gatekeepers controlling the conditions of their admission to it. This is very much what we have today. You will recognize the picture. Yet for these young people, their only hope of making a mark as a new generation lies in repudiating the future predesigned for them and projecting another in its place. And the result is that punctuated series of generational replacements, one after the other, that we call progress or history. But in this, Arendt sees only ruination. Her face is resolutely turned towards traditional ways. These alone offer a viable path into the future. And the question of education for her is whether our love for this old world, our amor mundi, is sufficiently intense to enable us to carry the burden of introducing new lives into it. Because only if it is, can there be hope of renewal for generations to come. Now, this burden of what I've called responsibility is indeed a heavy one, and it takes diligent work on the part of both adults and children. It's on the teacher's assumption. It is on the teacher's assumption of responsibility towards children in her care that her authority rests. Now, we tend to assume that any exercise of authority is confrontational, like that. As a subject, authority is something you face. But Arendt's argument implies the quite different posture of leaning over. The authoritarian figure is a guardian, not a tyrant, because responsibility calls for both care and protection. The responsible parent or teacher cherishes the child, much as a gardener nurtures a seedling in the ground, creating a sheltered milieu for them to grow. So we are back with culture, not as heritage, but as cultivation or nurture of nature, the new life born into the world. So can we imagine a society in which young and old, after their increasingly painful separation, could resume their co-participation in the labors of begetting? And naturally, today's parents are keen that their children should do well in the world, and the education they want for them is both rich and strong. Rich in its knowledge content, strong in the power and confidence it bestows. And mainstream education strives to satisfy these demands. It speaks with the voice of reason, pitting adult knowledge against childhood ignorance. It confers rank on its recipients, upping their life chances in a competitive society. But knowledge is one thing, wisdom quite another. To be wise is to welcome others into our presence, not to overpower them with the strength of what we know. It is to watch and listen and to learn. If knowledge arms us against adversaries, well then wisdom disarms. But by the same token, it leaves us exposed and vulnerable. And this is the vulnerability of elders, which comes from the realization from lifelong experience of how little they actually know. And among the young who come under their elders' wings, wisdom feeds curiosity. So let's imagine a pedagogy that joins the voices of wisdom among the elderly and the curiosity among the young, each soliciting the other in a correspondence that is aligned with the temporal stretch of life. Now, of course, neither juvenile curiosity nor seasoned wisdom hold much esteem in a society which values objective knowledge and the operation of reason above all else. Knowledge, which puts answers before questions, stamps out curiosity. Reason, which privileges cognition over attention, truncates wisdom. So within the value system of mainstream education, the innocence of curiosity is assessed as a deficiency of knowledge, and the humility of wisdom as a deficiency of reason. One is branded as ignorance, the other as senility. And for generation now in command of the present, the idea that the senile and the ignorant might together forge the future would be manifestly absurd. But to unite wisdom and curiosity appears to me not merely prudent, but necessary for the renewal of life for coming generations. And that finally, and I'll end here, leads us to an alternative model of education. Its passion is amor mundi, love for the world, and its vocation is not to bring the young into the light, as in the Enlightenment model, but to teach them to see in the dark. This model places the posture of leading out and leaning over before any divisions of academic standing. So subjects are not ranked on a ladder of attainment by the divisions of a formal curriculum, but retrieved and renewed in the voices of those who study them. And they wind around one another. As they wind around one another, these voices weave a rope of many strands that carries on as life does, never further from an origin or closer to an end. And such, in my view, is the way of education. Thank you very much.